So, perfect. Okay, so hello and welcome to our Almedalsveckan event around sustainable games in Europe. I want to start with a little story. Last summer, we were running a sustainability game jam in Skövde, and we were just kicking it off. I gave the opening lecture, I think, at that point, and it was sort of going through all of these questions of why do we discuss sustainability in games? And not everybody immediately has something at hand that has to do with why are games and sustainability an issue, right? So it started with outlining all of these issues that have to do with, for example, the questions around hardware on which we play digital games for the most part, right? Like questions of all of these devices that we use to run these games, to make these games. They are produced using rare resources, rare materials. Many times a good example is, for example, coltan from the Republic of Congo, which is oftentimes produced in very exploitative, racist and colonial structures. So conflict minerals really very, very tightly interwoven with gaming and the computational devices. Games and the hardware that they are played on are in a way a secondary market for the hardware that we already use to guide rockets and that part of military production. Of course, they are now connected to, like in other sort of industries in that regard, AI, which is a big element here, or crypto, or these sort of schemes. So this sort of hardware race to faster and faster and also more and more resource-hungry hardware is a tightly connected thing to the constant new console cycles and constant new hardware cycles that gaming is a part of as well. We can talk about the harsh labor conditions in the production of these hardwares, but also in the games industry. E-waste as the outcome and the result for the longest time in the life cycle of all of these devices that we play on. And then making it go full circle, come back to that, oftentimes the warlords that control maybe those coltan mines in Congo get indeed paid in weapons. So military arms trade connected to games, not only as the father of all things in the way of the origin of most role-playing games or gaming genres or the miniature gaming genres in terms of cultural origin, but also materially, and games as the military entertainment complex that makes it possible to maintain a cultural and hegemonic structure that makes us in the Western world accept that we run our culture this way, right? These are the things that we just discussed in this course. So then we take a short break and we have the student walk up to us. And she's talking about that she has this indie studio and they make this really cool game. And it's a really nice and innovative and fun and radical take on sustainability questions that the players can walk through, and super excited about the game. And then she talks about that, yeah, well, we asked, oh, how did you get funded? How did that work out? How did you start the studio? And she mentioned that, yes, we are part of, the funding we got is part of Meta and Facebook's efforts, well, to launch a number of small game studios to mitigate the necessity for European regulation around big platforms and platform production and sustainability requirements here. So she was aware that, in a way, her own studio, with the game she was excited to make, with the team that she wanted to be a part of, was part of a greenwashing scheme of one of the big platform giants who could single-handedly change how we make culture, right? This is where I come from, and this is why I come from this panel, because I have all of these things in mind, and I see a young creator here wanting to do awesome things, wanting to do amazing things with their culture and with their creativity, but then also at the same time realizing that there's limitations built on this, because the structures in which we make games are inherently, already from the start, unsustainable in this level. This is not a small question. This is a big freaking question that I'm putting into this room. Welcome to discussing this with us today. My name is Prax. I'm associate professor in the game design department here in Uppsala University campus, Scotland. We have a book coming out that is talking about sustainability questions connected to games and gaming, but I'm super excited to have here today with me in a panel Hugo Biller, a Swedish indie game designer, co-founder of the climate sake of the International Game Developers Association. He's going to talk a little bit about the games and about his projects that are going on, so I'll leave a little bit of your own introduction to you. We have Ossian here with us, a PhD candidate in HCI in Uppsala University in Uppsala, working in a game on project around building a sustainable games industry. We have Maria with us digitally. She is the managing director of the Sustainable Games Alliance, an international NGO working with industry partners to decarbonize the games industry, and Kriga Innerqvist, the vice chair of the technical board in Region Gotland and member of Socialdemokraterna. Excellent. So this is as much as I wanted to say to start this off, leaving this sort of impossible to solve problem over to you. Who would like to go next?
Well, if I may.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for getting on this panel. It was quite interesting when I got the question to be here. It was a new experience. I have never worked with this area before. As you mentioned, I'm on the technical board, so I put up the limitations or the possibilities to put the solar panels to save energy and so on. What kind of fuel we have in the cars in the region, in the municipal of Gotland, and so on. So when I got this question, I just, wow, there could be limitation of games and stuff. So I started searching and so on, and I actually did a survey on my own work, how many plays, and there was a lot of them. Quite cool. And I asked them about the games and stuff, and they immediately said that, well, I always buy the latest one, and then I changed the graphic boards, I checked the motherboards, and I just, what? For a game? Yeah. So the e-scrap, which we talked about when you told me to be on the board, on the panel, well, it came up to me that it is a problem, of course, and it's not regulated. I mean, I've searched everywhere. There's no politician that has taken this into their hand and trying to regulate or do anything to do anything about this. And it was quite interesting, actually. I suppose there is also, they talked about these games, there's large games using server, using a lot of energy, I suppose. I think there could be a limitation to that too. So my first take on this was to get labels like Kravmärkning, fair trade labels and so on into the gaming industry. That would be my take on this, to get the persons who are buying the product, they can choose what kind of labels they need. And of course there would be some kind of minimal usage of stuff. I suppose that's my take on this.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sounds like a great segue to Maria.
Yes, exactly. So talking about labels, Maria, would you like to go next?
Hey, as you said, I'm the managing director of the Sustainable Games Alliance, and it's a non-profit cooperative, and we basically help the games industry to reduce their emissions, but also, first of all, to understand their emissions, because like at the moment, basically, we still don't know what is the impact of games, because there is no global, regulation and understanding of the emissions of like games or probably software as well. And at the moment, we only have the greenhouse gas protocol, and the greenhouse gas protocol unfortunately leaves a lot of gray room. So in the end, at the moment, companies can still decide if they report their Scope 3 emissions, for example, which is a huge chunk of the emissions. It's like up to 95% of a company's emissions.
Maria, would you like to just let us know what Scope 3 emissions are for anybody who hasn't heard that yet?
So basically, Scope 3 emissions are all the emissions which you don't cause like directly, but which are connected to your product. So Scope 1 emissions are the ones which if you would burn fossil fuels yourself, for example, making a fire or something. And Scope 2 is anything connected to energy use and heating. And Scope 3 is everything else, which is like crazy because it's the biggest chunk, and no one has to report on that kind of moment.
And most notably for games, that means that all the emissions that are caused by your players playing the game, their rigs running down, like all of that, that would all be Scope 3, right?
Exactly. And I mean, basically, of course, hardware use, all the servers which you use to distribute your game. So here we don't have the real numbers, and we don't have a common way of calculating it. And this is basically what the Sustainable Games Alliance is addressing. We help the games industry to self-regulate so we can measure all of these emissions and start then reducing them. Because at the moment, no one knows where the boundaries are and who is responsible for it, kind of. Everyone says, okay, I'm not the one who is, producing the emissions. I'm only using the server, for example. Or I'm not the one producing the hardware. I'm just developing the game. And it's not about like for us to blame someone. It's about taking responsibility, looking at the emissions and the impact the games industry has, and look at the ways how can we systemically reduce these emissions. Because and it's not like only emission, but also the use of resources, right? So this, of course, if we as an industry look at this topic, it will be more time efficient and cost efficient for individual studios, because as you have mentioned as well, Patrick, most of the time it's not a problem of only one studio. We only can create a change, a transition if we work together, because especially the games industry is so interconnected. The supply chain is so complicated. If we don't address it as an industry, it will be really, really hard. Yeah. So yeah, and that's why we're developing a global standard, basically, to have a better understanding of the impact of the games industry, and then also make it easier for companies to then report and reduce emissions. So yeah,
Yes.
that's from my point.
Thank you so much, Maria. Like, this is, of course, super complex work where technical complexities around how you measure the use of this sort of piece of hardware go hand in hand with quite sort of political questions of, do you assign these sort of costs to the player or to the operator of the cloud farm and the servers? Like, and I really like this taking responsibility and this focus on material change. So thank you so much, Maria. Excellent. Hugo, would you like to go next?
Yeah, if I can get my tiny slides.
I just click your slides open and...
It's the wrong slide. That's the right slide. Here we go.
Fantastic.
So I'm here as a game developer and also representing the IGDA Climate Sig, which is a mouthful, but it's essentially an online community of game developers and game dev adjacent people who want to think about and talk about climate and environmental issues together. So yeah, 100% volunteer organization. We're now part of the Sustainable Games Alliance, so that's cool. We're intertwined with Maria and her crew. And we sort of see ourselves as the entry point for the green games movement. Anyone interested can just come to us and we'll point them to some place that shares their specific interests. And we have built a couple of resources that I just thought I'd mention. Do I just click on this? A couple of years ago, we came out with the Environmental Game Design Playbook, which, in short, identifies 4 sort of predictors for pro-environmental behavior, like what makes people behave in a pro-environmental way, and how can we use games to sort of move people in that direction, which resulted in these 19 different tactics with fancy names. I'm not going to go through all of those. So as you can see, like we're game developers, we're all excited about ways that we can culturally affect the world using games. So it's not just the footprint, it's the handprint, but I'm here to talk about the footprint, so I'm beating through this. We also have a database of basically every game that has ever done anything about environmental issues. It's huge and unwieldy, and it's great for researchers who want to just find what's out there. And we have a website called greengamedesign.com, which is a pretty recent development. That's just a huge smorgasbord of everything that you can think of that you could do to further environmental causes as a game developer. So we have, again, a lot of cultural impact here, but also more and more material impact, like how can we reduce the impact of the games that we make. So I would recommend you all to check out that website because it's already got a lot of cool stuff and growing every day. Not every day. So yeah, lots of different sides to this story. Obviously, we've gone through many of them, but I'd say a lot comes down to the tech that we use. Can we reduce that? Can we reduce the amount of stuff that we have to buy to play these things? The electricity used at runtime. Also, like data transfers, our games are getting bigger and bigger. That has a cost with download sizes and the energy used to do that. I'm basically here, I think, to personify how easy a lot of these changes are to make, because I have made many of them myself personally, and I don't even have a technical background. What I have is a smart meter from Claes Olsson, and an hour or two of just measuring how much energy is my game using when I run it in 4K resolution in this or that frame rate. Which led to this fancy energy use meter we had in our game Ultros, which is a very unscientific way of sort of measuring roughly how much impact your different options have on energy use. Spoiler alert: this is the real culprit right here, 4K resolution. If you turn that to HD, this goes down to about here. And I think that's the story you'll find in any game, like resolution and frame rate. There are myriad details to all of this, but if you only look at resolution and frame rate, you're telling 90% of the story, and that's where we need to focus our attention.
Well, I'll interrupt you here for a second, because we have this where you do something that is awesome to me, and you're like, oh, but this was easy, right? Like, just straight up showing to players what the emission and energy usage consequences are of different levels of frame rates, right? As you have done here with a simple sort of bar of energy intensity. Mm-hmm. Yes, it seems so easy. Nobody's doing it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right? Nobody is doing it. Talking about consumer protection, consumer agency, these sort of things. Like, this is not happening anywhere, right?
No, I haven't seen this anywhere.
Yes, so from that perspective, yes, it would be easy to do, but it should be something that everybody should do. Everybody should give the possibility to their players, to their consumers, to the people who make their games as well, to be able to make these decisions. So yeah. I'll talk a little bit more about
this
that.
Is the simplest integration. There's not, as you can see, there's no like CO2 number here. There's no, there's not even a kilowatt number. It's just a general idea. But I think that's all the player needs. Mm-hmm. It's we can spend a couple of more years on this making it exact, but I think it's very useful already to just have a rough ballpark idea. What else was I going to say? Mostly that like I'm still a bit perplexed that a lot of this isn't done as much, and that mainly I guess I'm perplexed that we're still chasing, since frame rate and resolution have these outsized impacts on energy use. Like you double the frame rate, you double the energy use. You 4K the resolution, you pretty much 4K the energy use. Mm-hmm. Not entirely, but on the GPU, yeah, whatever. So, what is the industry's like trajectory here? We're currently pursuing like 8K resolutions, so we're talking about 120, above 120 frames per second frame rates, which is already way beyond the point where humans can recognize the difference. Like, I only recently learned to see the difference between 30 and 60 FPS. I know people have different levels of sensitivity there. But Maria has a higher sensitivity, I hear. In my work, I'm constantly on the lookout for opportunities to lower those too, even if it's just temporarily, even if it's just in the pause screen, and guard against this movement of our industry of increasing it even further, which I think is madness, which is a place where I really think it's time for regulation to come in. That's probably enough for me.
You have another game that you're working on. Would you like to?
I'll name drop my current game, which is called All Will Rise. It's a narrative deck builder where you drive environmental court cases in the form of a card deck builder. Also, since I'm the lone programmer on this, it's very easy for me to go deep in energy efficiency. Even though it's a very simple game technically, there's still, if we can pull off another thing like the energy bar and Ultros, that's something that we can use to inspire other devs, even though our emissions are tiny. And I think that I can never stop talking. But I think that goes for the industry as well. Like, we are part of a larger tech ecosystem. We can say that the games industry has small emissions. I would add that they're small, but some of the stupidest emissions that we have in our system, because they're so wasteful. So much of this is so unnecessary. But the things we do can inspire and also regulate the rest of tech, which is a huge, quite low-hanging fruit, I think. Okay, done.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, then let's get Maria back on screen here. Whoops, fantastic. There she is. Awesome.
Yeah, I think that was a great segue to what I want to talk about.
Yes.
You end ramble So my name is Christian. I'm a PhD student at the Department of IT in Uppsala. And as Patrick mentioned, I'm part of the Game On project, financed by the Swedish Energy Agency, trying to kind of map out, model, and hopefully lessen the energy consumption of the Swedish gaming, so both in consumption practices and production, and also associated activities such as Twitch streaming or other forms of media consumption in and around the whole gaming field. Something that I want to touch upon today, and which my current research is looking at, is thinking quite seriously with the Swedish context and the Swedish industry, and then hopefully thinking with that a bit higher on the European level as well. So for those unfamiliar, super brief crash course in the Swedish gaming industry. It's quite oversized for the small size of this country. Per capita, it's one of the kind of best producing national contexts in the world, with a kind of export level and turnover in the same size as Germany, which is almost 10 times the population, right? And even has an export volume claimed by the industry, at least, to be comparable to that of Swedish iron ore, for example. So it's noticeable as an industry in economic terms. The amount of people employed is perhaps not as impressive, but still around 10,000 people in local Swedish, and even more if we count people working in companies overseas owned by Swedish entities, right? So this has been kind of marketed and named as the Swedish gaming wonder, the Swedish games wonder, which is a term we should take with a bit of grain of salt, of course. It comes from industry marketers and lobbyists and PR people, but I think it tells somewhat of a useful story here, something that I want to engage with. Perhaps more recently what's happening is and what's happening here today, or in this week in Almedalsveckan, there's been some movement on kind of game politics in Sweden and in the European context. So games has, in Sweden, kind of been allowed into the kind of the more prestigious halls of Swedish politics. So for example, the cultural department has, as their theme this year, creative industries and games and gaming, both digital and physical, as kind of core focus. So there's a lot of work going on from industry organizations and what I term kind of brokers, people trying to broker gaming to the larger public and to policymakers specifically. And I think here is a real touchstone to get into what you were talking about now, because what those policy suggestions or ideas and ways of addressing the supposed crisis of legitimacy for games that not being taken seriously on a political level, neither on a societal level. It's a thing for kids, it's something you do for fun rather than being a serious cultural product or technical artifact or even commercial business entity, right? So this is something that's being currently quite heavily negotiated and investigated and published in reports and so on. But what this also positions games as is in relation to other things rather than only to itself and its own problems. So then we get into the idea of games as related to tech in general and these massive platforms and how we think about the green transition, for example. So game has been lobbied and thought of as this super green way of doing a national economy and producing high GDP growth because it's immaterial, right? The rights of publishing and stuff are immaterial digital artifacts or legal entities rather than being steel or forestry. So therefore, there's a movement now to make games and the cultural industries in general, but games specifically, as a new basic industry for Sweden. So the one that's kind of carrying out the large load or a large load of the Swedish base economy. And if we want to be taken seriously, a basic economy and a basic industry also has all these kind of requirements to fulfill to be taken seriously on a national political level.
So it's like a protected term.
No.
Okay.
Anyone or protected, or it's not a protected term, but there's different agencies that kind of anoint different industries with this. But there's no, from what I understand, at least I'm not an economist, is that there's no real kind of official marking of this. It's more like a prime minister or a finance minister can anoint a business as such or other. I mean, what they hope to gain is some sort of tax advantage or being taken seriously, that it's like spillover effects of being named as such. And I mean, when I go to different talks here, when people talk about security and the developing situation in the global kind of sphere of influence, people then talk about these other basic issues, like how do we protect our industry and how do we protect our competitiveness and the Swedish economy from suffering from global upheaval or war or whatever. And I guess in extension, this would then also protect games in the sense that it's in the Swedish national interest to have gaming be prosperous and competitive and economically viable. So like trying to get perhaps a bit to what the talk description was talking about. I think this is an area of influence that hasn't really been explored. So the current voices and people organizing in relation to games politics on a Swedish level and perhaps even on a European one are mainly industry groups and interests with incentives that are perhaps not specifically aligned with what kind of a real ecological sustainability could be or would look like.
And also not aligned with smaller game developers, I would say.
Often not aligned with small game developers,
which is
but that's a truth with some modification. There's pushes for like national funding and investment strategies for smaller companies to build up this ecosystem of these like indie hits and unicorns type of stuff. So it's happening on several levels, but it's still mainly commercial in its formulation. And if we look elsewhere in Europe, there's similar developments, but where perhaps the ecology question or the social sustainability questions or other of these kind of non-directly commercial points that are being brought up alongside the purely economic or technical ones.
Thank you so much, Ossian. So, if I try to connect these different perspectives a little bit and roll it up, right? Like, so these the points that you're making here about games becoming or already being a central element of the Swedish industry, Swedish culture, right? The way we make culture for each other, right? That's being something that we also need to think about how we want to support it and how we want to legislate that. At the same time, having sort of an absence of informed policy around that, where there's a vacuum that might get filled and we have conversations going on that don't necessarily involve all the actors. There are some perspectives on smaller makers, but if you consider that the games industry, if we talk about it like that, we could also talk about game making, right? Or game design or something like that. That isn't immediately calling to mind a comparison to Swedish steel industry, because I don't think that's necessarily valid. There's not a lot of young people out there that are like in mining going to challenge the Swedish games industry, the Swedish steel industry. But the origin of the Swedish game wonder is somebody making a game by themselves with some friends together in a game jam in their community, right? That these perspectives are sometimes at least getting lost. There's some support for them, but they aren't really driving bigger questions of policy. They don't reflect necessarily the perspectives of Swedish game makers that are, as far as I experience them all the time, very concerned about their communities, about their environment, connected to nature, like all of these things that, for me also, Hugo, you do represent in some way, right? And my students represent what they care about. They come to our game design education not to make big stacks of green. They come because they have made an emotionally human connecting experience with games, where games enrich their lives in some way, and now they want to give that further to somebody else. They want to express themselves through this in a human, meaningful way, right? I think these perspectives are often getting lost. We don't encourage that as much and I think that's sort of sad, because to me that's the core of the Swedish game wonder, really.
Yeah, but I mean they say that they tell that story as well, and they always they repeat that 90% of the companies are less than 10 people or whatever. But in the next breath, what they're actually doing is trying to support the big players.
Yes, then they need tax cuts, right? And
deregulation.
Yes, and these are other stories, right? Where then they still have a story, and then they say that we need to have more luxury houses to be able to attract senior developers, which is like. So outside of that, right? We have, like, from my perspective, what I would like to see then is a real perspective that takes also Maria's point here on board of making material change, right? The really interesting point that where Maria, as far as I have seen, is one of the few people and the SJ that are lifting this perspective up of actually reducing energy usage. Straight up. We need to not just like maybe carbon offset a little bit here and there, but actually think about, okay, so what is the real next step for real self-regulation that looks at reality as it is, measures it properly, and then say, okay, so where can we do better, right? Like, we need systemic change that is having a material impact and that is powered by us collectively working on it. Not just an individual somewhere that goes unsupported, but collectively. And I think that needs to happen on all stages and all areas. Taking new perspectives and that we can do from design and showing them and highlighting them as best practices so that we can all start using them. Supporting them as, okay, so we have designers, members of the industry, creators that already find new ways. Now these can be things that we need to think about in terms of consumer protection as well and support them so that these new perspectives of making games sustainably don't lead to a competitive disadvantage, but instead of something that can maybe put you ahead. Right? So that would be a way of doing that. And then including all of these perspectives into what could be considered really like a Swedish game industry or a Swedish game wonder that also we would like to our students to graduate into because they care about these perspectives, but maybe then are worried that they won't be able to get picked up, or if you join the industry, that is something that you have to sort of be shut up about or something like that. So this is from my perspective, the big goal needs to be systemic material change beyond greenwashing. Beyond saying, oh, but we're doing so many good things, like people, it's like, yes, we have a message, we have a voice, we have a message that we give as we can make games that can change how our players behave, but we also have our own responsibility for the way we're making them. And I think that is super important. Maria, would you like to add in?
I of course fully agree. I think we actually have a bunch of parts of the story to make it happen. I mean, I fully agree that the games industry is more is consistent of a lot of people who are let's say very conscious and thinking ahead. So I think there is a lot of potential, and they are creative and they understand also like the global challenge we are facing. I think at the moment what is actually missing is to create the pressure which is needed from the industry to be able to then have legislation which would address these topics. But I think if we as an industry get together and self-regulate as a first step and decide this is what we want to do, it will be easier to then get politicians involved. Because at the moment I see the problem that sustainability or reducing emissions is seen as something which is a counter argument to growth. And to be honest, at the moment, we have so many low-hanging fruits, it would not be even against a growing business. It would be helping businesses to be more efficient, because like if we think about energy use, and if you design a game which uses less energy, it will also improve your player experience. People can have like a longer battery lifetime, they can use their old hardware, they don't have to buy like new hardware all the time. So this is something which would be good for the player as well.
You don't have to wait to download stuff.
And then, I think we have to talk about, like as an industry, get together and make sure what do we really want, and make that hurt. Because we have a lot of really big corporations which might have a different agenda. So we need to know as an industry what we want and make this voice heard.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
And there's examples for kinds of regulation that haven't really worked. Regulations around loot boxes haven't really functioned because they could be sidestepped, they weren't really anchored with industry professionals or with best practices, so that doesn't really function. So we don't want to replicate these sort of mistakes, right? So there it's important to have that connected to what could actually be leading to real change. And this is something where I would like to repeat that, making it a competitive advantage for studios who already care about sustainability now so that they can be more productive in the future.
Yeah, I've thought about this regulations. If you're supposed to regulate your own business, kind of, what incentive do you have for doing that? I mean, it must lead to something like the business is taking the lead, and the consumer is as I see it, the consumer is the one buying the products. If they see that you have these labels or efficiency, whatever, then they will probably, so it will be, the regulation will be for the customer, I suppose, to buy the right game or not the wrong ones, so to speak.
Yeah.
And perhaps, as Ossian mentioned in another conversation we had, there is, I mean, the government or the politicians could be the funding of these, companies that have these, the right labels of the right amount or something like that, perhaps.
Yes, exactly. So specifically, if there's a starting grant to start a company or to get some sort of government support, right, that would be connected to, and then you need to do proper sustainability reporting, make sure that you stay within certain boundaries, right? So I think that would make sense, even as a sort of specifically sort of Swedish funded game production. Then I think it would still be important to have this, like, when I drew up this sort of big picture in the beginning of all the ways in which games are connected to all these tech industries, but also cultural sort of elements that make it possible to continue this sort of exploitation of the planet. I think that is at the same point a challenge that I just dropped on you, but it's also an opportunity, because it means that games making a change has the potential for a lot of knock-on effects later on. If we would change how we produce these sort of accountings, what kind of limits we have about energy usage, that could have a knock-on effect on how hardware is produced globally for other sectors as well. Right? We have seen something like that. When first more gaming on laptops happened, suddenly there was a push to reduce energy usage because it would drain otherwise your battery too fast. And the entire hardware production for computers shifted. Right? Similar for mobile phones. Right? So we can do this. There's cases for how that has worked. There's cases for games that didn't reach any sort of goals that were set for themselves because their hardware requirements were too high. Cyberpunk, for example, 2077 is one of the prime examples for something like that, right? So there's spaces where we can really think about what is the opportunities that come with games sitting here, right, smack in the middle. If we would say that you want to make a new console that you sell in Sweden or in Europe, or maybe actually in Europe, because I think this is a point where we need to step up in Europe to think about how we address this, because there's nobody else, more and more clearly, nobody else on the planet that is necessarily doing this, right? So we cannot trust our transatlantic partners to take these questions forward first. That would lead to a really, really big change in hardware production, because now all of the hardware producers that want to sell something in Europe would have to think about how do we reclaim e-waste, how do we build different structures to solve something like that.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, and I think it's also tied into thinking about other venues for doing this same type of work. So, for example, with the energy agency that's funding us, of course they're worried about and thinking about the total kind of emissions profile of Sweden. That's one of their tasks given by the government. But they're also super worried about the stability of the Swedish energy grid and how that is related to gaming. So, for example, the Swedish peak energy consumption is in winter nights, which is also when people like to game a lot. Like these of course overlap. So then you can also think and talk about and make policy suggestions that's also about Swedish sovereignty and sufficiency and security. It doesn't have to be, I think we hurt ourselves if we limit only with this kind of, it's called the carbon emissions blinders, and connect it to other things, because I also think that's make them more kind of politically forceful, and they have leverage with people who are perhaps not as knowledgeable about the kind of inside the gaming jargon, but it resonates in other issues, and we can kind of leverage what's hot or what's geopolitically important at the moment for wider benefits.
As an example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine led to a huge boom in talking about energy efficiency in general. Like in the SIG, we almost had that to lead with for a while in talking about these things rather than the ecological side of it.
Cool. There's the last question. I would like to ask if there's one thing that you could pick that you think should be the next thing we should be doing to address this, what would that be? I could start. I would like to see a default eco mode for all games coming out in the future. That it's still possible for players to, if they really want to, crank up to play on the crazy rig, the high resolution. And if you are a competitive, like first-person shooter player, then by all means, then if you choose that this is where you want to spend that energy, that is your prerogative. But I think it should be a default eco mode that when you start a game for the first time, it downloads with low resolution files so that your first download isn't already super high and you can play it, and ideally optimized for echo mode as a starting point. So that would be, I think, from my perspective, a reachable, sane first step for going towards a more sustainable games industry.
I was going to say that too, so I'll just elaborate if that's okay.
Yes?
Because I just think it's a beautiful solution, because most people, depending on where you set the bar, but if you set the bar at around, say, resolution and frame rate, again, it's what all games have in common. If we set the bar at HD resolution, let's be generous, no, let's not be generous, let's say 30 FPS. Most people are going to be absolutely fine with that, and the people who are not are almost to the man, the kind of person who can go into the options and change these things easily. So I think there's an elegance in that solution. And there's a power in it because 90% of players do not go into the options or care about these things. They just use the default settings. So that's why what we set as the default is probably the most important thing.
And it wouldn't even lose so much, because at this point you're reaching what normally you cannot even perceive as a difference with your eyes anymore.
Yeah, but importantly, I think we still cater to the people who do have that sensitivity and who do appreciate 4K visuals and 120 FPS. And I have friends like that. I know what they can get like.
Thank you. Who else?
Yeah, well, I saw the bar. That was quite cool. I would like to have that in every game, so I can see that. So let the customer see how much energy I use. That would be the greatest thing.
In every computer program, why not?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's just not limited to the games, of course, the OS and so on.
Yes,
Of course, and the labels.
thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if I have something that's like doable tomorrow, but I really think we need to start seriously thinking about and organizing kind of political alternatives and groupings that can be a voice of other ideas and notions as a counterpoint, and align with people and actors here and elsewhere that are in agreement on these notions. And I think they are more easily found than we perhaps perceive them. We just need to get that all over.
Thank you, Ossian. Maria?
I mean, I again agree. For the eco mode, actually, so the default mode is very important. Ubisoft found that out, that I think it was 80% of the players continue to play in the eco mode, which they implemented in For Honor, which is like a great number and was able to save a bunch of energy. So this is definitely a thing which is something like all the studios could do. And like from my perspective, what we need is like a global standard of measuring the impact. Just because like at the moment, even if we would introduce such bars, if we don't have a common understanding what we are measuring, and it doesn't need to be 100% exact, we just need all to agree how we measure it on one methodology so we can compare it. Because at the moment we don't have a way to benchmark and compare basically the outcome of studios and the claims of studios, which is a huge problem because the consumer does not know if the company, what it says is true or not. And I think with a global standard where we could compare the outcomes which studios claim and the different claims, that would make a difference.
Yes, otherwise there's no real conversation even possible because there's no facts. Yes, we have a question.
Yeah.
Do we have time for the question?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, because it's actually just because Maria mentioned it. I wanted to actually ask the perspective of probably Maria or anyone else in the panel. So Ubisoft and Nintendo made their names a bit of mud beyond their usual ways by basically claiming that games are no longer owned, they are rented. And so essentially the question I've got is that since now they've kind of removed what used to be the appeal of permanence, so we wouldn't keep just consuming games because they were expensive, so we'd buy them once and we'd enjoy them and play them over and over. Now we can just rent a game, toss it, and then just move on. So what are your feelings about that? Like this kind of just excess consumption culture that these big studios are now propagating and trying to force us into?
So Ray's question is, given that games are now sometimes propagated to be only rented and not owned by big studios anymore, does that potentially make it worse because it's lending itself more to notions of just sort of quick in and quick out and gaming instead of having this one game that you maybe cherish and play again and again because this is something that is part of your identity and maybe into your playing practice.
Yeah, I mean, great point and great question. I think this is also where I come into thinking about this a lot, thinking with kind of critical technology theory and like writing on, for example, techno-feudalism, which I think this is kind of related to. It's like we don't own anything, we're moving beyond what's known as kind of capitalism or late-stage capitalism, and power and influence is more and more being allocated to these massive corporate or feudal actors. And I think here, unfortunately, games is too small to really do anything, right? Like Xbox is at Microsoft, and we have this massive umbrella already.
Yeah.
So, but I think it's important to call it out as such, because we are so fast, I think, or we, but games kind of discourse to be enraged about these developments and talk about Sony and Nintendo doing these horrible things, but they're really just emblematic of larger societal developments. And for example, in our project, we're looking as well at cloud streaming of games. So this is even to a further extent. You don't even have it on your own machine, right?
Yeah.
Which then implicates the massive construction of data centers and all of that we also know is very climate intensive. So I think this raises questions of ownership and how the economy of society in general is developing. And therefore has massive direct material climate impact, but also quite dreary future imaginaries on how this will develop if it continues in this fashion, which it likely will. Because power has been allocated to these factors.
And the philosophical implications on all of this. Like, I mean, my favorite book on that is Vincent Moss Goes to the Cloud, even though it's quite a few years old by now, as a political economy analysis of that, right? So we are, as an industry, then if I use that, further and further removing the responsibility for these emissions, for these energy uses, for this hardware, for these communities that don't have water anymore because it's used to cool the servers, right? Remove that further and further from us and the player to some sort of in-between nameless black box of production that happens to be our environment, right? We externalize costs further and further to the planet that we don't even see, that we don't need to account for, and at the same time even remove consumer protections, because now you're not a consumer anymore, you're just this like entity somewhere that gets to have a little bit of entertainment on the cloud somewhere, right? So it's really, really tricky to approach that from a perspective, and that intersects with all of these sort of political notions of what is like a human society, right? It comes to me back again and again, at least, right, as a game design teacher to my students. None of them have come to study game design because they want to build the more efficient onboarding process for young people to one of the corporate cloud platforms. Right? Yeah. Because that is what it's becoming. It's a way of getting an installing little icon to get this young person to be pulled either into the Appleverse or the Microsoftverse or whatever that would be, so that they stay there, so that cannot be, I really hope so, cannot be the end point economically of the culture that I love and the cultural expression that I love and dedicated my life to study. So games need to be more than just that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you all, by the way, for a very interesting conversation. It's been very stimulating sitting here listening to it. I just want to provide some kind of my perspective. A few years back, I used to work at a company that did life cycle analysis for foods and beverages. So we would measure the kind of the total climate impact of a product that you can buy in the store. Now, be that a cut of an animal or be that a piece of fruit that you buy in the store. What would be the total life cycle emissions of that food product? Now, the challenges that we faced is that the industry, you would have these kind of passionate spirits, basically these small players that are challenging the big companies that would happily sign up to doing something like this, to be able to label their food, to say that, oh, we have, this many carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of products, and compare that to some kind of, it's not as high as our competitors, but the big players don't want to sign up because they're a for-profit organization that answer to their shareholders, and they don't actually have an incentive to sign up because, I guess this goes back to Maria's comment about a self-regulating market, is that it didn't self-regulate. The big players didn't care And another problem was that we weren't the only player in the market doing life cycle analyses. There were other companies that were using different methods of measurements and different system boundaries for their measurements. So every comparison, unless they were on the same platform, literally became like an apples to oranges comparison. And so that kind of leaves me feeling disheartened with, the notion of self-regulating industries, because they're just not going to do that. It's all about profits in the end for the shareholders. So what do we do about late-stage capitalism?
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
I mean, it's like in the end, it's a capitalism problem.
Yeah.
Like your problem is a capitalism problem. Point, yeah, it makes sense on some ways, right? In others, it already goes beyond that, right? Techno-feudalism is, as it's sort of being conceived, like following capitalism and technological late-stage capitalism structure, where it's not even about that anymore. Even if you could make a case for this as financially viable, you still allocate more power to these few actors, right? So I think there's limitations to giving the responsibility for systemic change to exclusively consumers or to exclusively businesses. That is why I think regulation is at some point needed. I think that it needs to happen on all of these sort of levels. So it's necessary that this systemic change needs to be carried by people in the games industry who care for it and point out the meaningful legislation and meaningful limitations that would make sense for them to work around, and that would make sense for them to do cool stuff with, and then maybe instead of competing on who can burn the most energy to make the best image, they compete on with the brightest minds in the industry and creators who can make the most amazing experience based on an energy budget that is within our global boundaries, so that you can have an amazing game and also breathable air. So that would be a next step. That should be carried ideally by informed players who care about that and who can say, oh, this is also good for my wallet, right? By members in the industry that, okay, this is going to be a competitive advantage because next year these requirements will be a little bit different, and my game is fine, it's already optimized to that, it will still be able to be downloaded in the European Union in different spaces. So I think we all for the most part agree with you as these sort of limitations, but it doesn't mean necessarily that that self-regulation isn't a part of that as well. It needs to be connected to systemic material goals, because if it's only, and then the consumers make different choices, profit, that doesn't work.
Yeah. Thank you.
I just wanted to add on that, because in the end we need all to work together. So self-regulation won't happen if we don't have the political pressure at some point, because of course all the companies are also under pressure. They are under pressure to perform. If there is no political benefit of introducing this self-regulation, it will be hard. We all need to work together. It's about leadership for me. It's about finding ways to stand by your values within your framework where you can, because I believe that if we agree on a industry-wide standard and have comparable data, it will be easier to have a transformation. And this is something which everyone can be part of. It can be players, it can be leaders from the games industry, it can be politicians. And if we don't work together on it, we will fail. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So yes, I think on that word, we need to do together. Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for coming today for this discussion. Thank you, Finn, for helping us with the camera. Thank you all so much. Really nice.